Greetings, welcome back to Black Bear News, where we are discussing climate change and abrupt climate change, and also things adjacent. So this is an article. I want to start this video with a really good headline: Escaping Extinction Through Paradigm Shift. This is from Nafiz Ahmed. I've read articles from him before. He's very good. It's from Medium. Rebellion is not enough. We need to build new systems from the ground up right now. For the last month, as a journalist and academic, I've experienced a strange sensation of paralysis. I don't usually experience this. Usually I find myself driven by the pressures of wanting to cover with due justice a full spectrum of intersecting crisis and potential solutions. This month, watching the spectacle of political madness unfolding across Washington, London, and Brussels, while chaos and suffering continues to kick off across Venezuela, Yemen, Israel, Palestine, Syria, Nigeria, and beyond, I experienced something I haven't felt in a long time: a sense of total burnout, of futility, of tiredness. Anyone else feel this? Raise your hand. Watching the news has become like entering a psychological boxing ring where you get the shit punched out of you repeatedly until you drop to the floor, broken, bloodied, and inert, helpless. I can't imagine this is a particularly unique sensation, but I wanted to share it with you because this is common ground. Common ground across the deepening divides tearing our societies apart. No matter which side of the divide we stand on, the sensation of paralysis and helplessness is playing out in tangible form in the political processes we see out there. The sensation of paralysis is therefore not just a psychological artifact. It's the internal experience of the systemic dysfunction playing out in the world. It's a reflection of the state of collapse that our prevailing democratic institutions are experiencing as they prove completely incapable of responding to and solving for the intricate complexity of inherently interconnected, converging global crises. Funny, if you were on my Facebook timeline, you wouldn't know that anything was wrong. Everybody just seems to be having a fucking great time. It's just a wonderful life. There's nothing wrong. It's just bizarre. It's true. How to deal with the other has now become the defining sticking point of contemporary Western politics. It is particularly exemplified in the paralysis of the UK government and Parliament in the face of the Brexit process, the paralysis of the US government over the Trump administration's wall, the inexorable mainstreaming of anti-other sentiment across Europe, and in the extent to which the failure of the incumbent order to resolve internal crises has driven the resurgence of new forms of extreme politics, inspired by nativism and nationalist rejections of groups of people considered both foreign and parasitical. Within this paradigm, expulsion of the other is the final solution. This is the zero-sum game model of existence. There's not enough to go around, so we need to accumulate as much for our narrowly defined selves as possible. More growth, but just for us, because they are the ones taking our jobs. But rumbling beneath the surface of this obsession with the other is a deeper problem that we find much difficulty facing up to. The fact that the system of life we have built for ourselves, and which many of us think is being undermined by too many of them, is already collapsing in its own right. There has been welcome media coverage of startling new UN report by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. The report concludes that human civilization is systematically destroying its own life support systems, resulting in the potential mass extinction of at least 1 million animal and plant species, maybe perhaps a few more. The driving motor of this destruction is the endless growth paradigm of our current global economy, a paradigm that has seen human populations in cities grow exponentially across the world, in turn driving the exponential growth and consumption of resources, raw materials, food, and energy. That accelerating expansion of industrial civilization as we know it has ravaged natural ecosystems, leading to the decline of numerous species who are critical for the continued healthy functioning of natural surfaces, providing food, pollination, and clean water that are essential to sustain our own civilization. If we continue on this path, our ongoing destruction of nature, forests, and wetlands will fatally damage the Earth's capacity to renew breathable air, productive soil, and drinkable water. The report is by far the most comprehensive to hit home how the collapse of biodiversity ultimately entails the collapse of human civilization, but it is hardly the only study confirming our current trajectory. In February, the UN Food and Agricultural Organization issued its own comprehensive global assessment across 91 countries, warning that prevailing agricultural techniques were destroying the biodiversity needed to sustain global food production. According to the report, of 7,745 local occurring in one country breeds of livestock reported globally, 26% are at risk of extinction. Nearly a third of fish stocks are overfished, with more than half having reached their sustainable limits. And 24% of nearly 4,000 wild food species, mainly plants, fish, and mammals, are decreasing in abundance, a number likely to be much higher due to lack of data. Another report about this out this month by the World Wildlife Fund and Global Footprint Network outlines how this massive, systematic environmental destruction is rooted in a way of life based on overconsumption of natural resources. We are growing beyond our means. We are taking without giving back. The new report shows how if everyone in the world consumed at the same level as EU residents from the period of January 1st to May 10th alone, humanity would have used as much as the planet's ecosystems can renew over the entire year, which means that 2.8 planet Earths would be needed to provide for this level of consumption. So there is something fundamentally wrong, yet for the most part, our political leaders are preoccupied with the surface symptoms of fundamental crisis of civilization rather than the crisis itself. The UN IPBES Global Assessment, for instance, confirms that the planet is currently experiencing 2,500 conflicts over fossil fuels, water, food, and land. Conflicts which are therefore directly related to the ongoing collapse of Earth's biodiversity. These conflicts are driving the mass displacement of migrations of people across the world, in turn radicalizing political bureaucracies and triggering extreme nationalist responses. This month, a new study by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center of the Norwegian Refugee Council launched at the UN headquarters in Geneva found that a record 41.3 million people worldwide are displaced inside their own countries due to conflict and violence. This is the highest it has ever been, an increase of more than 1 million since the end of 2017, and 2/3 more than the global number of refugees. The report flags up particular crises. The ongoing conflicts in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Syria, a rise in intercommunal tensions in Ethiopia, Cameroon, and Nigeria's Middle Belt region, which together contribute to most of the 10.8 million new displacements. Many of these disruptions are directly linked to climate change impacts. In 2018, extreme weather events were responsible for the majority of the 17.2 million displacements. Tropical cyclones and monsoon floods led to mass displacement in the Philippines, China, and India, mostly in the form of evacuations. California suffered the most destructive wildfires in its history, which displaced hundreds of thousands of people. Drought in Afghanistan triggered more displacement than the country's armed conflict. And Nigeria's crisis in the Northeast was aggravated by flooding that affected 80% of the country. The climate connection was further underscored in a major scientific study published earlier this year in Global Environmental Change, which concluded that climate change played a significant role in migration and asylum seeking from 2011 to 2015 by creating severe droughts, which drove and exacerbated conflicts. Coffee. Conflicts across the Middle East, Western Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa were exacerbated by climatic conditions, eventually resulting in as much as 1 million desperate refugees turning up on European shores. That mass migration, of course, played a pivotal role in the UK campaign to leave the European Union and the revival of nationalist sentiment across Europe, the US, and elsewhere. By the end of the century, it won't just be migration we have to worry about. It will be if we continue business as usual, an uninhabitable planet, a situation where we, too, will end up becoming the other. And this is where the sheer futility of conventional political responses and prevailing political discourse rears its ugly head, because, of course, whether or not we leave the EU will have literally no meaningful impact on itself, on the fundamental systemic drivers of mass migration. Neither will whether or not we do indeed build a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. Yet while the planet burns beneath our feet, we are preoccupied with essentially irrelevant questions whose answers offer nothing of substance to address the real crisis to which, for all intents and purposes, we are blind. It is no wonder that following the inspirational lead of Greta Thunberg, some have seen little option except to take to the streets through protest movements like Extinction Rebellion. The hope is that sustained nonviolent resistance can compel governments to take the urgent action necessary to transition rapidly to fossil fuel-free societies. But there is a serious fault line in this approach. XR suffered from a serious lack of joined-up thinking. It was not grounded in a comprehension of the climate crisis as a systems crisis, and therefore failed to explicitly link up climate action to other key systems such as austerity, food, water, politics, culture, and ideology. XR therefore failed to appeal to the working class and largely occluded people of color and diverse faith groups. Okay. I didn't hear about all of that. The other fault line is that the target of action, national government, may well have missed the point. Governments are merely nodes in a wider system of power which they do not really control, but tend to pander to, a system of power which we are all to varying degrees and in different ways complicit in. It is precisely through governments that the prevailing system has, over the last several decades, carefully built up a special resistance to the power of street protest. This is why the largest demonstrations failed to derail the Iraq War. Counterinsurgency doctrines, fine-tuned in theaters of war, have been increasingly applied in domestic settings to counter, disrupt, and neutralize all forms of protest action. The fear of what Samuel Huntington once called the crisis of democracy has meant that governments have dedicated themselves to ensuring that direct protest action has little tangible impact as possible. Hitting the streets and hoping the powers that be do what you want is therefore not a viable strategy. That doesn't mean that XR shouldn't be a part of a wider strategy. But right now there is no wider strategy. There's no cross-coordination between groups and sectors to create a more systems-level understanding of the crisis and therefore enable a more systems-level vision of solutions. And there is a very key reason for that. The response, which sees open rebellion as the only feasible form of reaction, is a direct result of the degrading impact of a system whose entire design is to invoke a sense of helplessness and apathy in citizens. The problem is that liberal democracies in their current form are in a state of collapse for a reason. They are indeed incapable of addressing the systemic complexity of the crisis of civilization. No amount of nonviolent resistance will provide our existing political institutions with the capacity to address the crisis, because the problem runs much, much deeper. And until we address the question of transforming the very sinews and structures of contemporary neoliberal capitalism as we know it, the defining economic paradigm of our global civilization, we are speaking the wrong language. Indeed. But even here, this transformation is not simply a question of economics. It is a question of our entire paradigm of existence. And it is here, and recognizing that the current crisis is calling us not merely to a fundamental transformation in our external relations, but one that is simultaneously coextensive with our internal being, that the pathway for action emerges. Over the past 500 years or so, humanity has erected an endless growth civilization premised on a particular patchwork of ideological worldviews, ethical values, political and economic structures, and personal behaviors. This is a paradigm that elevates the vision of human beings as disconnected, atomistic, competing material units which seek to maximize their own material consumption as the principal mechanism for self-gratification. This is the paradigm that defines how we live in our everyday lives and constantly bleeds into how we end up conducting our relationships with our family and friends, in our workplace and beyond. It is a paradigm that has cemented our own current trajectory toward mass extinction. This is not just about external systems. It's also about the internal systems of thought, with which the external is coextensive, and through which we have imprisoned ourselves. Our entire reductionist mechanical model of what we think it means to be human needs to be rewritten. To break this paradigm requires far more than making demands of broken institutions, because let's just say it, lay out our cards and be totally honest here. For most of the largely middle-class white people that participated in the XR protests, it's really not that difficult to do so. The biggest gap here is that it doesn't necessarily require an act of transformative change on the part of the protesters themselves. This is what is missing from our response on the crisis of civilization. Our responses are based on demanding change from the other. Whether it's governments or philanthropy or business, it's about calling to account everyone other than ourselves. The problem is out there, and we have to shout and glue ourselves to the ground to get them to listen. When are we going to realize that they are us? It's not that we shouldn't protest or call for institutions to change, but far more than that. If we are really serious about this, the far bigger challenge is for each of us to work within our own networks of influence, to explore how we ourselves can begin changing the organizations and institutions in which we are embedded, and it means grounding this effort in a completely new frame of orientation, one in which human beings are inherently interconnected and interembedded within the earth, where we are not atomistically separated from the reality in which we find ourselves as technocratic overlords, but are co-creators of that reality as individuated parts of a continuum of being. It's a really nice sounding paragraph, but I mean, what does that mean? Whatever, I mean, you know what I'm saying? What does that mean? And how do we get to being here? Whatever happens out there in the world, the crisis out there is calling unto each of us to become who we need to be, truly are and always were, and on the basis of that internal renewal, to take radical action in our own place-based context to build the seeds of a new paradigm right here, right now. How can we change some of the systems within our schools, our places of work, our places of play? How can we harness learnings from our personal practice and transformation as people and family units and translate that into working with our local communities to galvanize place-based change in our own local context? How can we plant the seeds for new organizations, institutions, businesses, political approaches through our own actions, even while we call on pre-existing ones to take urgent action, refusing, however, to simply wait idly for them to do so by starting up ourselves? How can we, throughout these efforts, work towards seeding the recognition that the great task is to build a new post-growth, post-carbon, post-materialist paradigm? Let us not simply go to a protest. Let us build our own capacity as individuals and members of various institutions to think and do differently within our own consciousness and behavior, as well as across energy, food, water, culture, economics, business, finance. By doing so, we plant the seeds of an emerging paradigm of life and reality that redefines the very essence of what it means to be alive. This is the conversation we need to begin having, from our boardrooms to our governing councils. For those of us who have woken up to what is at stake, the real question is, how can I actually mobilize to build the new paradigm? I like the gist of this article, and I find most of what he has to say to be true. I mean, definitely we need like, you know, radical change, like beyond what people describe radical change is right now, you know. And clearly we need to rethink everything it is about how it is that we live. But I get a little bit annoyed at the whole, like, you know, words, you know, let's live in a way that makes everybody whole and, you know, binds us to the earth. You know, what the fuck does that mean? Like, we need actual, like, clear, concrete, you know, actions that we can take. You know, it's cool if we all, like, meditate and go within and find our answers, and that's good. You know, I think we all should do that. But at the end of the day, we need action. We need action, like, real fast. We need action, like, you know, years behind us. And we need to figure out what the concrete steps, you know, that it is we need to take in order to get to where we need to go. And, you know, we're obviously going to transform ourselves in the process, or be transformed. That's all I have for you in this video. Thank you so much for your eyes, your ears, and your conscience. Hope you all had an enjoyable weekend. If you would like to support this channel, you can do so at the links below. Until next time, peace.